Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we're going to reconsider that long-held assumption that Malays largely live in rural areas. Now, however, due to migration because of jobs, there is a new reality. And understanding this new demographic and psychographic is imperative for policy effectiveness and also for political consequences. Now, where is this new Malay Heartland? Joining us on the show to help us answer that question, we have Iskandar, Fareez, Communications Director for the think tank Research for Social Advancement, or better known as REFSA. Also, Badrul, Hisham, Ismail, he's the Director of Programs at the think tank IMAN Research. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Melisa.
Thank you. All right, so I want to talk about the evolving nature of the Malay social and political identity, self-identity. How do you understand that evolution, say, in the last 2 decades, since the year 2000? Maybe I can start with you, Iskandar.
Okay, I think we can set the stage for this evolution in the words of, in the concept of urban Malay dilemma. So we are facing an urban Malay dilemma.
So not the Mahathir's, not Mahathir's
so it's a
Malay
new
dilemma. It's a new dilemma, okay.
Yeah, so over the years, we've seen a lot of migration among the Malay community. So they are migrating from the rural area to the urban area, making the community, the Malay community in the urban areas a large part of the population. So the thing is, in our psyche, we always think about Malay equals to rural.
Right.
But that's not the case anymore. We are seeing 70% of Malays living in the urban areas nowadays. And if you can see the proportion-wise among other communities, Malay is one of the highest. It's, you call it, it doesn't reach 50%, but it's around 40%, which is proportionally higher than Malays, than Chinese and Indians.
Okay.
So we are seeing a larger trend of Malays in urban areas. So this needs to be acknowledged today lah.
Okay. Badrul, what about you very quickly? How has the Malay political and social identity changed?
I think I echo what Iskandar was saying about how the urbanization development or the urban development of the country has pretty much impacted the self-identity and the communal identity that what we call as Malays are. And not only Malays are moving into urban areas, the rural areas themselves are turning into urban areas.
Okay.
And with this comes open or exposure to different culture, different worldview, because not only local exposure, but Malays studying abroad, coming back, bringing what they see outside, and so there's an ever-changing sort of self-identification that has been going on.
If I may add, so when we say about the Malay heartlands, so we are not looking at Malay heartlands as the kampung last time that we remember, the idyllic village with the coconut trees, the veranda where we lepak. It's now the kampung Kerinchis, the Desa Mentari, the Shah Alam, the Bangis, the low-cost flats, the terraces. That is now the Malay heartland.
It's very fascinating. In fact, Mazlan Muhammad, who is a sociologist based now in Singapore, formerly from USA, made precisely this point, especially in the peninsula. And I think we're largely confining our discussion to the peninsula. We're not looking at Sabah and Sarawak, where perhaps the dynamics are different. I do want to bring up this, what's been very interesting about the development of Malay political and social identity, which is the role of political parties. And because recently, just last Tuesday, we had this major event, the conviction of Datuk Sri Najib Razak, former Prime Minister, on these charges of corruption. Part of a, now a 2-year cycle of crisis for this party that's shaped Malay identity. Iskandar, do you think that this conviction or things like this really have an impact on how people perceive themselves?
So it depends on which Malay crowd are you looking at. Of course, when we say Malays are now 70% urban, it doesn't mean that all 70% has the same mindset or psyche.
Okay.
We still have a spectrum of Malays. We have the conservatives, progressive, liberals, the middle ground. So we are talking about different socio-economic backgrounds that shape their mindsets and views about the world, politics, and day-to-day happenings. So I would say if you're a hardcore supporter of the former Prime Minister, you wouldn't change your mind. You still think he's innocent. But on the other side, the majority, the silent majority, you would say, okay, this case has gone and been charged. Now what about us? Because for them, the concern is about livelihood. How do we live day to day? Some more with the COVID crisis that we are facing right now. That will be the front and center of what they have in mind.
Badrul?
Yeah, I think what we need to be careful is to not get fixated with the idea of the fixation between UMNO is Malay and Malay is UMNO. And I think that is one of the things that we have seen changed for the past 20 years, where if you talk about new political parties are, a lot of them are Malay parties in the sense that they are majority members are Malay. Parti Amanah Negara, PPBM, they're all Malay parties. So the idea that when we talk about UMNO, that it's always the representation of Malay, that's something that we need to reconsider for the past 20 years. And to say that how the conviction is might be a slap to Malay, supremacy, or to the position of the Malay community, for example, I think that might not. We shouldn't go that far, because Malays are more than that. Like what Iskandar was saying.
But there's no denying that political parties such as UMNO and PAS have shaped the way Malays think about self-identity, right? And it's always very closely linked to religion and this idea of Ketuhanan Melayu as well. So talk to me a little bit about the role of the political party in shaping that self-identity for urban Malays, because it's very different from, say, what we understand as Heartland Malay last time, the idea that political parties have a strong hold on Heartland Malays. Is that the same for urban Malays? Do urban Malays have the same kind of political affiliation with political parties? Badrul, do you want to try?
Yes,
Bandar Baru Bangi, I think it's probably a lovely case study, I think, in that.
Well, I would say one of the advantages that the political parties have is they are given the platform to set the narrative of the identity politics that the country is sort of either dealing with or following. And for many years, a lot of the discussion between the different ethnic communities have always been pretty much influenced, if not shaped entirely, by the political discourse. But then again, like what Iskandar was saying, the narrative has always been the same. Malay Heartland, rural area. So we need to help the Malays that are out there in the kampung,
Right.
so that they can be more empowered. But again, the data in 2020 now says that not all of them are living in the kampungs anymore. But that also doesn't mean that all urban Malays are progressive or all urban Malays are liberal. In fact, ethnic tensions have always happened in urban areas rather than in the rural areas. So what we see is a more diverse set of community that faces very complex challenges, and they express their needs and those conflicts in very different ways.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, gentlemen, but after this we'll continue this conversation. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. We're chatting tonight to Iskandar Fareez from REVSA, which is the think tank Research for Social Advancement, as well as Badrul Hisham Ismail from IMAN Research, another think tank. Well, gentlemen, let's continue our conversation about this evolving Malay identity, particularly driven by urbanization. This is the new Malay Heartland, and it's often in urban areas. You mentioned areas like Kampung Kerinci, Desa Mentari, and the like, right? Shah Alam, yes. So specifically, Kampung Kerinci is fascinating to me because right next door to Kampung Kerinci is Bangsa, and there's always that discussion of the Bangsa bubble. So talk to us a little bit about the urban Malay and its relation to class and location, because you can have urban Malays in Kampung Kerinci and urban Malays right next door in Bangsa, not quite the same two demographics or psychographics. Iskandar?
So I always joke that the Bangsa bubble is divided by that Jalan Bangsa because you have Telawi on the one side and the Bangsa Utama on the other. But yeah, when we talk about Malays, it's not monolithic. It's a spectrum of it. So it depends on your education background, socio-economic background, how exposed you are to what entertainment or media you consume. So that would shape your worldview and how you see things, how you interact with others. And when we say that, it's unfair to say that urban Malays are all classy or liberal or savvy in a certain way or the other. So we have that kind of variation. So I think to the right question would be, what would be the policy implication when we discuss about urban Malays?
Right.
When we discuss about urban Malays, we need to think about the spending about rural and federal territory. So I take an example of last year's budget, 2020. Even though KL population has about 40% Malaysian living in it, we are talking about the greater KL conurbation. We have 40% of Malaysian living in it, while rural areas we only have 20% living in it. But because we are so hard up with the old thinking that Malays are rural, and we need to fight for the Bumiputera agenda, that Malays are rural, so we spend a lot disproportionately in rural areas. So the budget for 2020 went to the rural ministry about 5.3 times more than the federal territory ministry. So we have a very large disproportionate investment in that sense.
But it's a politically wise one when you consider that rural constituencies are disproportionately represented in parliament, right? So it's for a political party, this is a good investment.
But you need to also consider that some of the urban Malays would go back to the kampung and vote.
Indeed, right.
Yeah.
So those are the complications in terms of the electoral game. I do want to ask about this diversity issue, and I'll ask you, Badrul, you know, Malays have always been diverse, like any community they're diverse. UMNO itself, led by royals in the very early days, but representing peasants as well. So the idea of diversity isn't new. I mean, the act of diversity isn't new. What's changed about that diversity and the way it's organized itself politically?
I wouldn't say that there's a change in terms of the diversity. If there's any change, it would sort of increased. There's an increase in the diversity, and I want to bring back to your question about geography, about different places with different types of Malays or different socioeconomic status, and that's the very important part when you talk about urban development. Is that development happens in place. What happens in Bangsa is different from what happens in Kerinci. The needs of the development and the challenge of the development is very different from these two places, even though they are next to each other, because it depends on who runs the constituents. It depends on who are the local councillors. It depends on who live there, what kind of jobs are available in these two places. So it produces different challenges and it produces different types of communities. So in a sense that with urban development and even more urban areas are going through these rapid changes, the diversity is even more challenging, because we are not talking about Malays, poor Malays or rich Malays anymore.
Right.
All different kinds of community are living in that area with different kinds of needs.
You know, you said that this is the new Malay dilemma, and I'm just wondering whether there's been a lot of literature and research in this. When we think about how evidence-based policy is created to, say, help Malays, has there been enough discussion and research done about understanding the needs and aspirations of Malays in these urban areas?
I think there are researchers and literature out there. It's just that maybe they are not being mainstream enough. Because the data that we have, 70% urban Malays, 70% Malays are living in urban areas are from DOSM, Department of Statistics Malaysia. But unfortunately, these kind of insights are not being publicized enough.
So are our policies still based on the assumption that most Malays are living in rural areas?
I would say so. Most of our, like I said, given the example of the recent budget, this is not too far ago. This is just end of 2019. We are still spending and a disproportionate amount in rural areas, while we have other problems like urban poor, poverty in the urban areas that we need to face. So imagine if that kind of money is being spent in the right way to upskill or to empower these people in the urban areas. That would do more service or justice to the Bumiputra agenda that some political parties are championing.
Right. Badrul, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think just to add on a little bit more is that when we accept the fact that Malaysia has become even more urbanized than we thought that we were, in the end we need to get out of the idea of a race-based policy or a race-based politics, because the reality of urban living is that everybody lives in the same place, everybody coexists with each other. So we cannot have a race-based politics when the geography of the area or the constituency is not considering only one ethnic community living there anymore.
But isn't much of Malaysian politics, as it is in many other countries, driven by competition over access to resources, and that political parties do mobilize particular constituents in order, with the promise of greater access? I mean,
Yes.
I'm going to give you more than your neighbor is, I think, the essential template for much of politics. Is that likely to go away? Badrul?
I wouldn't know whether it's going to go away or not, but I think it is wise for us to go away from there, because like the demographic that we are facing now is no longer ethnic based. So we are still talking about resources, we are still talking about making sure each community have adequate resources, but those communities are not bounded by ethnic anymore. Those communities are bounded by a geographical area, the location, the councillors, the Majlis Pembandaran, for example. So those are the specific that we need to talk about rather than ethnic.
Like the day-to-day experiences we are seeing now, the urbanites are seeing the same thing. Regardless of you Malay, Chinese or Indian, you are still facing the same problem if you live in that particular area. So like Badrul said, it's wise to move away from this racial lens and to a more pragmatic lens.
Okay, another quick break, gentlemen. We'll be back and we'll continue this conversation in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. We're speaking to Iskandar, Fareez from REFSA, as well as Badrul, Hisham, Ismail from IMAN Research. Sharaad, you had a question.
Yeah, the question of identity, of course, is also intimately tied up with the sources of the components, of, the resources for making up that identity. And the media is hugely important in this regard. I mean, Iskandar, what do you think is the urban Malay worldview being produced now? Who's producing it? What media is shaping it? Or is it that diversity? What do you see?
I think the media consumption habits among rural and urban folks are pretty much the same, because now we have the democratization of media through social media, the digital revolution. So we basically much consume from Facebook, our websites, WhatsApp. So basically the same. I think the important question to ask ourselves as we move forward is, now that we know that most Malays are urban, what do we do with that information?
Right.
Yeah, so we know that most Malays are urban. So from now, we need to focus on how do we develop this group, this community. Bud and I, we were just talking outside regarding the 15-minute cities. So
what's that?
So it's no longer a city where we focus the growth or the development on certain key areas like Kuala Lumpur, Penang, Selangor, or Johor, but we have each urban areas as their pockets of growth. So we decentralize growth. So we have a city that can self-sustain in a 15-minute area. So I guess Bud can share a bit more about this later. But this is the new concept that we need to focus on, so that each city is a thriving space for the community to thrive.
Okay, so 15-minute cities, is
Yes.
that going to stop or stem migration to other urban areas, keep Malays in where they are, living and working where they are? Is that
I
what you're
wouldn't say it
thinking?
would stop migration, but I would say it would give people more option to choose where they live, because with the 15-minute city concept also means that you can work where you live. So you no longer have to live in a suburban area and commute to work in the central district because living arrangements is not affordable, houses are expensive and all that. But the whole idea is wherever you get jobs, you will be able to find an affordable living in that area.
Is there a generational issue here that you've got younger Malays moving to the urban areas predominantly for jobs, leaving the older generation in the secondary towns?
I think it has been a trend ever since the 2000, where people from the rural areas will move to KL, and then as KL grow congested, then Bangi will be more populated, and then now we see Seremban too. So it's
suburbanization.
Yeah, sprawling.
In fact, Selangor tipped into a mostly urban state, like 20 years ago. I mean, this is not a new story in many ways, right? So this idea that you have about how people ought to live, who do you see driving that agenda? I mean, do you see the state? And the state has been very important and fundamental in the shaping of Malay political identity. Or is it something that's going to be something driven by the market and through, a voluntarism and a sense of how we want to live?
I think the state has a large role to play. So COVID has actually given us an opportunity, a rare opportunity, to reflect and reset.
Right.
So when we reflect, we see that things are not working anymore as we wanted it to be. So urban areas are sprawling, it's not planned, so it's an opportunity for us to rethink and build back better. For this, we need a mission-oriented policy to arrange or to develop certain areas as growth centers, as we discussed earlier.
So this is the state directing.
It's a
growth and
partnership, I would say, because it's more incentivization rather than direction.
Badrul?
I would add a little bit that urban planners and developers have a huge role, because they are the one who would, suggest, or they were the one who come up with the planning and new vision of urban living and all that. So I think there's a role that, same with architects, there's a role that they should play in promoting a very suitable and sustainable form of urban living that we should have.
In fact, what's interesting is the question of who's listening to these urban planners and architects, one, and two, in fact, who's listening to people who live in cities. And local government elections, of course, is something that been pushed as a way of democratizing this conversation. What's your position on local government elections, Iskandar?
So seeing that more Malays are now in the urban areas, so I don't see how the racial argument against it holds water. So we really need to think on how to empower these local governments, because it will shape how we see or develop cities and urban centers in the future.
You're absolutely right about that kind of the fear, the racial concerns over restoring local government elections. And that speaks to me as a complete lack of understanding of our society, on how our society has changed, especially with the urbanization. So how can we change that? How can we change that narrative? How can we talk about this change in our current urban landscape and debunk the myth of racial concerns for local government elections?
I think we need to re-look at or understand the role of local councils. A lot of the responsibility that a lot of the ADUN are facing are actually responsibility of local councillors, making sure that the roads are good, making sure the infrastructures are available, making sure that the housing are available. But because somehow we are not talking about that, those responsibilities are being pushed to ADUN, where they have party lines that they have to follow and all that. So I think one other thing is to re-look at whose responsibility is about managing the neighborhood and managing the city level and managing the national level, because these are all different level of the government that should look into it, rather than one whole federal government looking at everything.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. Thank you for spending your Raya Haji with us this evening. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Selamat Hari Raya Adil Adha, and thank you so much for watching. Good night.